Love is not always light. Sometimes it is a dark hallway, where people lose themselves when they no longer recognize their reflection in the mirror. Infidelity is not just betraying someone, it is betraying the best version of ourselves, the one who still believed in loyalty. There are nights when someone sleeps beside one person but dreams of another pair of eyes. There are kisses exchanged not out of love, but to fill the void slowly consuming the soul. Today we recount the shadows that love sometimes leaves behind. Not to justify, not to forgive, but to remind. Loving the wrong way can sometimes be more cruel than hatred itself. And here is the story. Her name is Elena Whitmore, 41 years old, head of planning at an art book publishing company in Portland. A woman once described as the warm flame of the office, sharp, gentle, and always carrying the faint scent of early blooming orange blossoms. She once loved the man of her life deeply, Mark, now a university professor teaching existential philosophy. A calm, intellectual husband, never loud, never ostentatious, but that was exactly why she chose him. And yet, after 17 years of marriage, that was also what made her no longer recognize herself in the mirror. They once traveled all over Italy with backpacks and a notebook filled with the names of charming little cafes. They once vowed never to go to sleep without saying, "I love you." No, but once is not enough to keep a woman, especially when that woman starts to feel invisible. Elena is the kind of woman who still dresses well just to go to the supermarket, still applies lip balm before bed, and still teaches her children to write handwritten letters. But for the past 3 years she has lived like a shadow. Mark was busy with his philosophical research on existence, yet he forgot the existence of the woman in their own home. Their eldest daughter had gone off to college. The house echoed every evening, and Elena too felt like an echo in her own life. She did not cry. She did not blame anyone. She just began to fall silent. Silent when Mark spoke of Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, without once asking if she had a tiring day. Silent when the man who once kissed her forehead every morning now only left behind the scent of cold coffee on the kitchen counter. Silent, even when another man began looking at her as if she were still worth adoring. Elena was not a weak woman, but she had begun to soften, in the very place she once believed was impenetrable, her heart. From the outside, Elena and Mark's marriage looked like a framed painting, neat, warm, and perfect enough to be displayed in the living room of any model family. They did not fight. They were not jealous. There were no shattered glasses or raised voices meant to wound. But they no longer spoke to each other. Life moved forward like a permanently programmed routine. 7 a.m., Mark left for work. Elena made coffee. In the evening, Mark read in his study. Elena watched an old episode of a show. In bed, their backs faced each other, their breaths steady, not out of peace, but as an escape from conversation. They still celebrated each other's birthdays, still sent goodnight texts if one was away, still attended church together every Sunday. But all of it now felt like two veteran actors reciting lines they knew too well to need real emotions. Some nights, Elena stayed up late just to wait for Mark to leave his study, hoping to hear something about his life. But he would only place a kiss on her hair, cold and hurried, then turn away to sleep. She started to wonder. Perhaps the things left unheard are what truly kill love? Mark never lost Elena through a single act of betrayal. He lost her bit by bit, through all the days he was absent. There is something more painful than arguments. It is when two people no longer see a reason to argue, because all expectations have withered away. And in that empty space, when a woman begins to doubt her own worth, even the gaze of a stranger can become the only mirror reflecting what she has lost. Her vibrancy. That day, Elena had only planned to visit an art photography exhibition to select images for a new book her company was publishing. A project about unspoken moments in love, ironically the very thing she lacked the most. She hadn't planned to stay long, hadn't planned to linger by the wine counter in the left corner of the room, and certainly hadn't planned to respond to the gaze of the man standing beside a photograph of a woman in a misty forest, her eyes looking towards something distant, something even the photographer could not describe. Is this sadness? Or hope? His voice was just loud enough for her to hear, yet not clear enough to sound like an intentional conversation starter. Elena turned, thinking he was speaking to someone else. But those deep brown eyes had been fixed on her all along. Adrian Keller, 43 years old, a photographer who once worked in war zones, now living in a small studio on the outskirts of town. He was not conventionally handsome, but there was something rugged, grounded about him, as if he had seen too much loss and had learned to cherish the smallest details. At first, their conversation revolved around lighting, composition, and paper texture. But somehow, it slowly touched upon silences Elena never thought she would share with a stranger. The nights spent listening to the rain with no one to tell about it. It feels like I've slowly disappeared from my own life. And I can't even remember the last time someone told me I was beautiful. Adrian didn't offer flowery words. He simply listened. And when she laughed, a little self-conscious, realizing she had spoken too much, his gaze remained steady. When you laugh, you look so alive. Like you just stepped out of that photograph. Just one sentence. But her heart beat differently. Not because of who said it, but because it had been too long since anyone had looked at her. As if she was still worth noticing. That evening, she left with a slight flush on her cheeks. And when Mark asked, "Was the exhibition any good?" she simply replied, "It was all right." But inside, nothing felt all right anymore. A week after the exhibition, Elena received an email from the company's PR department. A new campaign was about to launch, Portraits of Quiet Souls, a photography book project blending images with personal narratives, honoring those who live inwardly but with great depth. The list of recommended photographers was attached, and Adrian Keller's name was at the top. No one forced her to choose him. But when her finger hovered over that list, her heart skipped a beat. And so, he became the lead photographer for the project logically, convincingly, and entirely professionally. Their first meeting took place in a 6th-floor conference room. Fluorescent lights, a projector, schedules. Adrian arrived on time, carrying an old notebook and a camera that looked like it had traveled the world with him. He didn't look at her like he had that night. But when their eyes accidentally met across the projected screen, Elena felt it. Something between them hadn't faded. From group meetings they eventually had site visits, an old cafe in the arts district, a nursing home, a quiet library. Elena was there as the publishing representative. But professionalism couldn't suppress the moments when they recognized something in each other. Something both had long forgotten. One afternoon, while shooting in an abandoned church, the rain came suddenly. They took shelter under a narrow overhang, her hair soaked, her beige silk scarf clinging damply to her collar. Adrian took off his jacket and handed it to her, wordlessly. She accepted it, and for the first time their hands touched. Not by accident. Neither of them pulled away. Between the sound of rain, only their breaths and their eyes spoke. "I see you." Not as a colleague, not as a middle-aged woman in office attire, but as someone alive longing to be seen. They hadn't crossed a line. But sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with actions. It begins when emotions quietly leave the place they once belonged. Some conversations start simply, like that cup of coffee, after a long shoot by the abandoned dock. Elena sat across from Adrian in a small roadside cafe, golden light casting soft reflections on the raindrops still clinging to the window. She adjusted her scarf around her neck, still carrying the damp scent of his jacket. Neither of them spoke, until she blurted out, "Have you ever loved someone and still felt lonely?" Adrian didn't smile. He just looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. One day you realize they're still there, but no longer a place you can return to. His words made her turn away. She was afraid that if she faced him, he'd see the tears threatening to fall. They began sharing stories of emptiness. Adrian spoke of his ex-wife, a journalist strong and proud, who eventually left because even when you were home, you were always somewhere far away. Elena spoke of Mark, a husband who had never hurt her, but had also never realized how deeply she had been hurting. We're like two shadows moving parallel, never colliding, never blocking each other's way, but no longer walking in sync. Adrian listened. He didn't press for more. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply placed his hand over his coffee cup and gently pushed it toward her. "Drink it, before it gets cold." Just like emotions, once they turn cold, they're hard to bring back to life. Elena pressed her lips together, saying nothing. But deep down she knew. She had taken another step away from the home called Mark. Not because Adrian was extraordinary, but because he listened. And she had gone too long without anyone listening long enough to understand. That day's photoshoot took place in an old loft apartment. Wooden floors, high ceilings, golden sunlight spilling through large windows, painting everything in nostalgia. Elena sat, jotting down notes on the list of images that needed editing. Adrian was adjusting the lighting, checking his camera. Everything was quiet, professional, but too quiet to mask the emotions building between them. When she bent down to pick up a stack of papers that had fallen, his hand reached down at the same moment. Their fingers brushed. A brief jolt, but neither of them pulled away. His hand was warm, rough, like an anchor she never expected. She looked up, and their eyes locked. No words. No need for words. Because in that moment every boundary, titles, morality, logic, blurred into something insignificant. She withdrew her hand after a few seconds, faster than her emotions could name what had just happened. But Adrian didn't shift back into work mode. He stood still, watching her. "I should go," she said, her voice quieter now. He nodded. Didn't stop her. But his eyes never left her. Not even as she stepped toward the door. "Elena." She turned around. "If things were different, do you think you'd be happier?" She didn't answer. Just lowered her head, pressing her lips together. And as she stepped through that old wooden door, she knew she had just left behind a safe world. But she had never felt more alive. That night, lying next to Mark, her husband, still reading the newspaper as he did every night, she could hear every turn of the page echo in the silence between them. And the most painful thing wasn't the unfamiliarity. It was knowing that her heart had lingered in the gaze from earlier, longer than she dared to admit. Friday afternoon. Elena was tidying her desk when her phone buzzed. A message from the events team. "The venue walkthrough for the book launch will be at Moonlight Inn tonight, 6:30 p.m. She frowned. She didn't recall this being on the schedule. Just then her phone rang. "Adrian, did you get the update? They moved it up from next week to tonight by mistake." "Tonight?" "Yeah, I just found out too. You don't have to come if it's inconvenient. But if you do, I'll be waiting." Elena glanced at the clock. 6:02 p.m. A message from Mark. "Running late in meetings, don't wait up for dinner. Eat first." She turned off her screen, stood up and opened the drawer, reaching for her lipstick and the teal dress she usually saved for special occasions. She had made a choice. So effortlessly. Moonlight Inn, a boutique hotel on the outskirts of the city. Soft golden lights. A quiet jazz tune floating from the corner of the room. Adrian sat by the window wearing a pale blue shirt and a black blazer. A glass of wine already waiting. "I didn't think you'd come. And I didn't think I'd ever wear this dress, for anyone but my husband." Silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. And if spoken aloud, there'd be no turning back. They walked together, touring the gallery space for the exhibition. A long hallway lined with glass walls overlooking the garden, where string lights reflected off the rain-soaked stone, like a scene from an old film. On the way back, the rain started falling harder. Adrian grabbed her hand, pulling her under the side entrance awning, where no one else was around. Breathless, hair damp, lips trembling, and their eyes, still locked on each other. "I always thought I was someone who had control. I always believed I'd never cross a line. But sometimes, the one thing we can't control is feeling something for someone we shouldn't." He lifted his hand, gently brushing a raindrop from her cheek. She closed her eyes. Her heart pounded. A short distance, a shared breath, and a gaze, strong enough to shake every moral boundary. But they didn't kiss. She turned away, as if one more second of silence would make it impossible to walk away. "I should go." "I know." She stopped by the studio to pick up the camera she had left behind. Adrian stopped by too. Not planned. Or perhaps, they were simply walking in the same direction, as if fate had already decided. The studio was empty. Only the sound of rain tapping against the glass ceiling. The wind slipping through the cracks of an old wooden door. A warm glow from the single overhead light, soft, still, and dangerously intimate. Elena stepped to the table, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the camera. Adrian stood behind her, close enough to hear the weight of her breathing. "You shouldn't be here." "I know. I shouldn't stay. But you haven't left. She turned around. No space left between them. Their breaths touched. Neither moved. But the entire room seemed to tilt toward them. He raised his hand, not to touch her. Just hovering in the air, close enough for her to feel the warmth. I won't do anything you don't want. The most dangerous thing isn't what you might do. It's what you make me want. Her words made Adrian freeze. And then, she sat down on the bench by the window. The rain kept falling. The wind kept rattling the glass. And the air between them, thick, heavy like an unsung melody. He sat beside her, silent. No touch. Just two people who had buried their feelings for too long, finding warmth in each other's presence. After a while, she slowly leaned her head against his shoulder. No permission. No hesitation. Just too tired to hold the distance any longer. Adrian didn't move. His fingers curled into a fist, as if battling himself. And then ever so gently, he tilted his head, letting his cheek rest against her hair. No kiss. No promises. Just two grown adults sitting together, when the world outside no longer had a place for them. That night, Elena arrived home close to 11 p.m. The house was silent. The hallway light was still on. Mark always left it that way so she wouldn't have to come home to the dark. But tonight, that very light made her feel emptier than ever. She changed clothes and stepped into the bedroom. Mark was asleep, still in his work attire, his laptop open beside his pillow. Elena sat down on the edge of the bed, quietly watching her husband's face. The man she had once loved so deeply. The man who had stayed up all night when she had a fever. The man who had introduced her to his mother with so much pride. The man who had always fulfilled his responsibilities, but perhaps for a long time now, had no longer truly been in her life. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she opened Adrian's message. I stayed at the studio for 20 minutes after you left. Not because I didn't want to leave, but because I didn't know where I should go. Elena let out a small laugh, her eyes stinging. That was something Mark hadn't done in a long time. Stayed. Not out of obligation but simply because he wanted to be with her. The next morning, she woke up early, made coffee and carefully picked out a simple dress. And when she stepped into the office, the first gaze she met was Adrian's. And in that moment she knew. She was no longer just fond of him, no longer just admired him. She wanted more. Not sex, not drama, but to see herself, alive, breathing and desired. After that day she became painfully aware of every text message, every glance, every time he walked past her. And the scariest part? When Mark texted that he'd be home late, she didn't feel disappointed. She felt relief. That evening, Elena and Adrian were invited to a private launch party for a new art collection at Serena Hall, a place glowing with lights yet full of shadows. She wore a long silk dress, a muted blue-gray, like the moon after rain. She wasn't trying to seduce anyone, but she also wasn't hiding the desire to be seen. When Adrian arrived to pick her up, he stopped in his tracks at the hotel lobby. For a few seconds he said nothing. He just looked at her, as if unsure whether to step forward or step back. Throughout the night they talked, smiled, and kept a careful distance. But their eyes didn't know how to lie. Every time the chandelier lights reflected onto the dinner table, Adrian would glance at her, as if checking to see if she was still there. And when the last song played, a slow jazz ballad soft as a whisper, they stepped outside into the garden behind the main hall. Neither spoke. Only the sound of water trickling from the fountain, and the scent of lavender mixing with the cool night air. Adrian turned around. Elena was still standing there, arms crossed over her shoulders. She wasn't looking at him, but she also wasn't walking away. He took a step forward. Slow. Very slow. Until there were only a few steps between them. And then he stopped, as if afraid of himself. What are you afraid of? She asked, her voice barely a breath. That you'll regret this. She took one step closer, met his gaze. The only thing I regret is not letting anyone touch my heart for all these years. And then, no background music, no scripted lines, just two people too tired of holding themselves back. He cupped her cheek so gently, then leaned in. The kiss was not rushed, not desperate, not demanding. It was soft as mist, yet burned like embers left smoldering for far too long. Elena closed her eyes, and in that moment she was no longer a wife. She was simply a woman, for the first time in years being kissed as if it was the last time. After the kiss, they didn't speak. No one invited the other. But when the hotel room door clicked shut behind them, that small click seemed to silence whatever was left of their restraint. The room was bathed in warm golden light. The scent of oak and lavender filled the air. Elena stood with her back to him, hands reaching for the zipper at the back of her dress, trembling, because she knew she wasn't just undressing. She was unraveling every rule she once believed she would never break. Adrian stepped closer. He wasn't hurried. He simply slid the zipper down, slowly, like carefully reopening a wound long healed, yet still aching. Her skin shivered beneath the thin fabric, cold from the air conditioning, but warming under the heat of his breath behind her. "You can still stop," he said, his voice low. "Do you think I still want to stop?" she whispered, eyes fluttering shut. He pressed his lips to the nape of her neck, not rushed, then down to her shoulder, where the strap of her dress had already slipped away. Elena turned around. They looked at each other, breathed, didn't speak, and then they fell into each other. Not like in the movies, not in reckless passion, but slowly like a sad piano melody. His hands traced over places she had long forgotten. Her lips answered with trembling breaths, uneven, desperate, but unmistakably needed. The silk dress slipped to the floor. His shirt came undone, one button at a time. The sound of fabric meeting the ground, the creak of the bed frame, the rustling of sheets, all blending together like confessions too heavy to be spoken. Elena had never imagined she would do this. But when he whispered her name in the dark, and his fingers intertwined with hers holding on tightly, she knew. She had let emotions overtake morality, not because she lacked love for her husband, but because, for the first time in so long, she was being loved as a woman. Not just a wife, not just a mother, not just a worker, not just someone who had to hold it all together. The room was swallowed by silence. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner, the pounding of hearts. Two people in a moment that belonged to no one else but each other. The sheets were smooth as silk, cold at first, but warming with each burning breath against her nape, her collarbone, the curve of her chest. Elena didn't scream. She only breathed shallow, uneven breaths, stifled for years inside the role of the perfect wife. Every time Adrian touched her, it wasn't just pleasure she felt. It was the feeling of being seen, being heard, being wanted. His hands trailed down her spine slowly, deliberately, as if he were memorizing the body of a woman who had long stopped believing she could be desired. "Elena." He said her name, not urgently, but like a plea, like he was anchoring her to this fleeting night they both knew wouldn't last forever. She answered with arms around his neck, with fingers pressing into his nape, with a choked sob that never fully escaped her lips. No more logic, no more morality. Only feeling, raw, fiery, real. The bracelet she was wearing slipped off, hitting the floor with a soft clink, a tiny sound, but enough for Adrian to pause for a second, gaze deep into her eyes. "Are you sure?" She nodded, then exhaled as his lips traced down her neck again. The rustle of sheets, the faint thud of the headboard against the wall, a moan bitten back before it could escape, a breathless whisper, caught between pleasure and desperation. "Don't stop, please." They didn't make love like two people sneaking around. They made love like two people searching for themselves. In every thrust, every embrace, every whispered name in the dark. That night, Elena didn't remember how many times she shattered. She only remembered, in the very end, Adrian whispering into her ear, "You're alive, truly alive." And for one fleeting moment, she believed it. The morning after, Elena woke up in Adrian's arms. The sheets were still warm. The hotel room smelled of bodies, perfume, and wrinkled fabric, chaotic like the state of her mind. She turned to look at him, his eyes still closed, breathing steady, as if last night had been nothing but a sweet dream. But for her it was reality, and that reality made her stomach twist. Her phone screen lit up. For missed calls from Mark. One text message. "You're home late. Everything okay?" Elena clutched the towel around her and rushed into the bathroom. She stood in front of the mirror staring at herself. Tangled hair, faint marks on her neck, lips slightly swollen. Undeniable. She had betrayed him. No one had caught her. No cameras had recorded it. But somehow she knew Mark would feel it. 'Cause she, a woman who had once been unwavering, who had once held herself with pride, was now trembling as she typed out a message. I fell asleep at the office. Sorry, love. Sent. Her heart pounded, not from the fear of being caught, but from the disgust curling inside her. At home, the morning went on like usual. Mark still smiled, still kissed her cheek before taking their child to school. He didn't suspect, didn't question, and that very trust became the sentence hanging over her head. At dinner, sitting beside Mark, Elena instinctively pulled down her sleeve, hiding the faint red mark on her collarbone. She smiled at their child, talked with her husband, but inside she was hollow. He trusts me this much, and yet the voice in her head played on repeat. That night, when Mark had fallen asleep, Elena sat alone in the dim light of her study, her face cast in shadows. She picked up her phone, opened the old messages with Adrian, and wondered, do you feel guilty? Or is it just me drowning in this darkness? Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. I miss you. Elena locked the screen, exhaled, didn't reply. 1 week later, a week after that night at the hotel, Elena thought she could cut everything off. She quietly deleted Adrian's messages, avoided passing by the studio, and never stepped into their usual cafe. She thought that if she severed all contact, her emotions would fade. But things were never that simple. On Thursday evening, Mark called her. Something came up at work. I'll be home late. Have dinner without me. Elena nodded, though a strange feeling stirred inside her. The feeling of an opportunity. And that very night, Adrian appeared at her doorstep. No warning. No invitation. He stood there under the misty porch light. Dark eyes intense, his long coat damp from the night air, and a whisper. You can't keep running from me. Elena started to close the door, but her hand wouldn't move. She stood frozen as he spoke. We both have families. I know that. But can you look me in the eye and tell me you feel nothing? She stayed silent. If you want this to end, I'll walk away. Tonight. But if even a tiny part of you still thinks about me, then don't shut me out. At that moment, Elena realized the greatest betrayal wasn't that night in the hotel. It would be if she let it happen again. She trembled, biting her lip before whispering, I can't live like this. I have a child. I have Mark. I have a family that is peaceful. Adrian stepped closer. But this time Elena stepped back. One step, then another. Her heart pounded not from desire, but from fear. Fear of losing herself. Go home, Adrian. Her voice cracked. Before everything falls apart. Before I become someone I can't recognize. That night she didn't sleep. Messages from Adrian still came. Not persistent, just one line. I'll wait. No matter what you choose. Elena turned off her phone. And wondered, can I ever go back? To being a wife, a mother, a woman like before? The days that followed. Life went on as usual. Elena went to work, came home, cooked dinner, bathed her child, read bedtime stories like any other mother. She and Mark still had dinner together. He still asked, Are you okay? She smiled, nodded, said, Yes. But the silences between them grew longer, as if they were speaking through a fogged glass. No one had done anything wrong, but neither of them were really there. One evening, while tidying the old bookshelf, Elena found a photo album from when they were in love. Pictures of them at the beach, barefoot in the sand, Mark's eyes looking at her like the sunset itself. And then she cried. Not because she missed Adrian, but because she was no longer the woman in those pictures. Inside her, two voices argued. He made you feel alive, laughing, dreaming, beautiful. And what about Mark? He was there when you gave birth, when you were depressed, when you felt like nothing at all. Mark, her husband, was a philosophy professor at the University of Michigan. He spoke about the meaning of life, about morality, about the freedom of choice. But in his own marriage, he never noticed how far Elena had drifted. Philosophy of love. Dinner was quiet. Mark mentioned a lecture about Kierkegaard. The philosopher who loved deeply but chose to let go out of duty. Elena smiled, but inside something in her trembled. Did Mark ever feel like he was living a philosophical metaphor? Strong, righteous, but completely lost? Later that night, Elena locked herself in the bathroom, leaning against the cold tile. Her phone lit up. A message from Adrian. It rained today. I remember your eyes that evening. Elena closed her eyes. She hated herself for the way her heart quickened. She didn't love Adrian. Not exactly. She only loved the way he made her feel seen. Mark always said, "We must stay loyal to what is right, not to fleeting emotions." She used to admire that. Now it only made her feel like a chapter in a book. Analyzed but never touched. That night, as Mark read his book, Elena sat on the porch writing a letter. I once thought marriage was the final destination, where we stop and live in peace. But maybe I was wrong. Marriage is a journey, and when one person stops walking, the other feels lost. I don't want to betray you, but I also can't keep being a beautiful shadow beside you. Smart, resolute, righteous, but never once asking me, "Do you still feel alive?" Elena didn't send the letter. She folded it, tucking it away in a drawer, just as she had tucked herself away in this marriage. Mark looked up, his voice gentle. "You're up late again. Are you okay?" Elena looked at him, the warm yellow light casting shadows over his graying hair. A part of her wanted to collapse into his arms and cry, but instead she nodded and lied again. "I'm fine." Reason told her to stay. Responsibility reminded her. She was a wife, a mother. But emotions whispered, "What about you? Who are you living for?" Since noticing Elena's subtle changes, the way she lingered on her phone, the way she drifted into deep thought, the way she sometimes cried after turning off the lights, Mark had grown cautious. Not with jealous outbursts, but with a quiet sharpness in his questions, a searching look in his eyes whenever she smiled absent-mindedly. One evening over dinner he quoted Sartre, "We are all prisoners of the way others see us." Elena froze. She knew he was talking about her, knew he was starting to understand something. That night after dinner, once the kids were asleep, Mark spoke directly. "If you don't love me anymore, I hope you have the courage to say it. Don't let love turn into pity." Elena stood motionless, not because she was cornered, but because she didn't even know where her feelings stood anymore. Two worlds. Night fell. She lay beside Mark, their backs turned to each other. He slept. She stayed awake. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the porch in white. Adrian's message remained unopened. She didn't dare. Inside her, two worlds collided. One side, the man who once read poetry to her on rainy college nights. The father of her children. The man who held her through postpartum darkness. The other, the man whose gaze made her tremble, who made her feel young, desired, alive. She got up, walked to the kitchen, poured herself a small glass of wine. The letter she had written days ago still lay under the salt shaker. Not burned, not sent. She read it again, then laughed. How ironic. I write letters to a man I can't be with, but I can't even speak the truth to the man I sleep next to every night. She picked up a lighter. The flame flickered. Not to end something but to face it. Returning to bed, Elena reached out, lightly touching Mark's back. A gentle touch, both an apology and a farewell to the version of herself that had been lost in uncertainty. Mark didn't turn, but in the darkness his hand slowly found hers. No words were spoken. Cracks no one sees. Elena never thought she'd be the one to betray. In the early years of marriage, she had looked at other women who succumbed to temptation with quiet pride, believing she was different. She believed in Mark. She believed in herself. But hearts don't shatter from a single blow. They crack over time through tiny fractures no one notices. Adrian's presence was like a mirror. Not one that showed her beauty, but one that reflected the forgotten woman inside her. When he adjusted the strap of her dress during a fitting, when his gaze lingered just a moment too long, she knew, if she didn't stop, she would cross a line. But what was the line? Was it just an ethical construct, designed by a society where middle-aged women are expected to live quietly, gracefully, without resistance? She looked at the women around her. Some divorced, others living as strangers under the same roof. Who was right? Who was wrong? Or were they all just trying to survive under outdated definitions of marriage? In her mind, Mark's voice echoed. Philosophy teaches us to live right, but it doesn't teach us to live happy. He had said it once after a lecture on Nietzsche. And now Elena realized. She didn't know what was right or wrong anymore. She only knew she was slowly dying inside a marriage that was peaceful but emotionless. Admitting the truth. One evening, Adrian asked her to meet at the lakeside cafe, the place where they once took shelter from the rain. Elena went. No makeup, no silk dress, just herself, tired, conflicted, unarmed. Adrian didn't ask why she came. He simply said, I don't need you to choose me. I just need you to admit that you once wanted something different. His words stripped away the moral armor she had tried so hard to wear. Elena broke down in tears, not because of Adrian, but because she knew she had spent too long without a choice. That night, she returned home without saying a word. Lying beside Mark, she remained still. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel guilty. She felt regret. Not for loving another man, but for not speaking her truth sooner. With Mark. With herself. The kitchen was still the only place in that house where life had a sound each morning. The hum of the coffee machine. The soft clink of a spoon against a cup. The slow, gentle footsteps of their eldest daughter descending the stairs. And Mark's voice, steady, familiar as always. I'm teaching at the old campus this morning. Do you need the car? She turned, nodded slightly, as if nothing inside her had ever been in turmoil. But in that very moment of normalcy, Elena realized her choices were no longer just her own. A single misstep wouldn't just mean the end of a marriage. It would leave an unhealable crack in the souls of two children who still called her mom. That afternoon, as she picked up her son from baseball practice, he suddenly asked, Mom, if you and Dad don't love each other anymore, does that mean it's our fault? Her hands nearly slipped from the steering wheel. Not because he knew something, but because she had never imagined her child could feel so deeply. At that moment she understood. The fractures in a marriage don't always make a sound, but they can shake the very foundation of a child's world. That night, Mark walked into their room and placed an old notebook on the table. He said nothing. Elena opened it. Inside were the letters he had once written to her in their early days, the handwriting messy but filled with longing. On the last page he had written something new. I know you're lost. If you need to, I'll sit right here and wait for you to find your way back. Elena collapsed onto the desk, crying as if she had never allowed herself to be weak before. Outside the window, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the roof in white. That house. It had been cold. It had been silent. It had lacked fire. But it had never lacked one thing. A husband, imperfect but unwavering. And two children, who were the answer to every question of right or wrong, should or shouldn't, could or couldn't. Some affairs end because of guilt, but some end because of the eyes of a child.